Today's occurrence happened in New Orleans, Louisiana. When Herbert heard a hurricane was headed towards his hometown, he wasn't super worried. The storm would hit the Gulf Coast across several states. Evacuation didn't really cross Herbert's mind. His elderly mother was bedridden at the time, and they didn't really have a way to move her. When he told her a hurricane was coming, she reminded him they survived Hurricane Betsy previously, and she asked if he remembered that. He remembered. It was a Category 4 hurricane that hit the area a few decades prior when he was just a kid. Herbert decided to just board up the windows and kind of get the house ready for the hurricane. They were just going to try and ride it out. They didn't really have many options outside of that. What neither of them knew was that the storm headed to them would lead to so much more destruction and death than the hurricane they survived before. Because it wasn't necessarily the hurricane that would be the reason they didn't make it out of the disaster together. And it wasn't necessarily the hurricane behind one of the most devastating disasters in America, if not the world. The truth is, the horror behind this disaster is people and the decisions those in charge and with power did and did not make. I'm Tatiana, and this is allegedly the real story of Hurricane Katrina. Once again, I'm not trying to end up on a list, so the way I present this episode may differ a little from what you're used to. That being said, I used a lot of publicly available sources and information, which can be found at the website in the show notes. This is part one of a multiple-part series exposing a lot of jaw-dropping information, and it only gets more shocking as I go, but keep in mind, a lot of the information in this part is based on eyewitness experiences and may or may not change as subsequent episodes are released. Of course, do your own research, form your own opinions. And without further ado, Will, a chef at the time living in Jefferson Parish, heard about a hurricane around 11 a.m. on Saturday, August 27th, 2005. Parishes in Louisiana are like counties in other states, same thing, different name. Will chose to stay in town, but sent his partner, other family members, and 2 friends visiting from out of state away to get to a safe spot. Of those who heard about the hurricane early on, because to be clear, many didn't, Will wouldn't be the only person who chose to stay in New Orleans on Saturday. Thousands of residents did. Many of them were there during Hurricane Betsy. It hit New Orleans as a Category 4 in 1965 and killed dozens of people. It was the first hurricane to cause over $1 billion in damage, but that was a huge storm. Most people survived, and with the levees that they were told could withstand a Category 3 hurricane, some of those who stayed assumed they'd be fine. Donald was one of those people who thought that way. His mother also decided she was staying and could weather the storm because they had survived Betsy in 65 and there hadn't been a major hurricane since then. Donald was 5 years old at the time and remembered them driving away with water rising behind them. They survived the encounter, but Donald had always been scared of hurricanes since then. He wasn't going to abandon his mother, though, so on Saturday, they decided they would stay put. For Wendell Pierce, yes, the actor, he said in the documentary, When the Levees Broke by Spike Lee, which is where some of these witness accounts come from, but he was visiting the area for vacation and to see family living there since he was born and raised in New Orleans. But now he was back at the airport to go to Baltimore. When Wendell got there, he was confused because there were so many people there trying to get out. So he asked someone what was happening, why are there so many people in the airport right now? And they asked him, oh, you didn't hear about the hurricane? And he hadn't because he hadn't really been paying attention to the news or weather. He decided to go to his parents' house to talk about it, and they agreed to just take a beat and wait. If the hurricane was going to actually be bad, they would have been told evacuation was mandatory. And maybe they also remembered they have the levees. So with that, Wendell went back to the hotel he was staying at, right across the street from the Superdome, which is the huge stadium that hosts the New Orleans Saints football team, and just played it by ear. That night, then Mayor of New Orleans, Mayor Ray Nagin, could be seen on TV at a helpline call center warning everyone that the storm was going to be dangerous. Anyone actually tuned in to the channel were told that they should start evacuating and that the evacuation could become mandatory. He lets listeners know that the Superdome will be open as a shelter of last resort for anyone with special needs, and that any evacuees should take with them enough food and drinks to last 3 or 4 days. At 10 a.m. the next morning, Sunday, August 28th, a mandatory evacuation order was signed by the mayor of New Orleans. He didn't give his residents advice besides ordering them to leave, which I'll get into much later. For anyone watching a channel that gave them access to other local leaders giving advice to their constituents, the messaging was scary. At this point, Hurricane Katrina was expected to make landfall within 12 to 24 hours, so for many, evacuation just wasn't possible at this point. For many of the people that chose to stay prior to the mandatory order, leaving wasn't actually an option. New Orleans is an extremely walkable city, the most walkable city in America, and ranked in the top 5 walkable cities in the world. So many residents didn't have cars. Part of that was due to not being able to afford one, but in that city, it wasn't necessarily needed. Kind of like how a decent chunk of people living in New York City can get away with not owning a car, and a portion of the residents not even bothering with a driver's license. Population and city layout differences being ignored. So at this point, if you hadn't already left and lacked transportation yourself, you were stuck, because pretty soon airlines shut down. Before Louis Armstrong Airport actually officially closed, rental car companies closed, so anyone with the finances to rent a car to get out couldn't. That is, if the places still even had cars. Many who had vehicles to leave also just didn't have the finances to. Whether it was due to not being able to afford the extra gas to get somewhere far away, not being able to afford a hotel, or any number of additional expenses that go along with actually evacuating. And those who decided to leave because they did have the means to do so were stuck in traffic trying to get out. A lot of people went to Houston, Texas, since it was out of Katrina's reach and the closest major city, making it more likely to find help or accommodations. That's usually a 4 or 5 hour drive, but with the amount of people trying to escape, people reported the trip being around 16 hours. Now, since a mandatory evacuation was ordered, allegedly city buses were picking up evacuees that lacked transportation and taking them to shelters, including the Superdome, which, remember, was supposed to be a shelter of last resort for those with special needs. But due to some behind-the-scenes fumbling, was now where people were being shuttled. Anyone with a medical condition was to move to the Superdome as fast as possible, again, only known to those tuned in to see that messaging. Now, Wendell Pierce originally decided he was going to stay in New Orleans and ride out Katrina, but when they made it a mandatory evacuation on Sunday, he was obviously still at the hotel across from the convention center and Superdome. He got his bags and drove home to pick up his parents, and he saw lines of people already waiting to go into the Superdome. The people waiting there were told that it was a place of last resort, not a place to decide to go to wait out the hurricane. Wendell said it looked like a parade of people just waiting to go in. The Superdome was the only building in New Orleans rated to withstand a Category 3 hurricane. By 3 p.m., roughly 10,000 people were waiting at the Superdome. Those arriving with special needs were segregated. For the last-minute evacuees, the line of cars bumper to bumper trying to get out of New Orleans before the heavy rain hit that evening increased. Some of the people leaving at the last minute only left because they were out of food and realized they needed actual supplies to make it through the hurricane. But knowing it was now Sunday evening, the hurricane was hours away, and stores were either closed or packed and likely had nothing left in them worth getting, they left. There were clearly very different groups of people. Those who got the warning and immediately decided they were leaving, whether that be because they heard the word hurricane and left, or waited until it was mandatory and did what they could to get out. There were those who survived Betsy and decided they would stay and ride out Katrina, even if they had the means to leave. There were those that, for one reason or another, couldn't leave, be it health reasons, financially, or just lacking a way out. For some of the people that chose to stay, be it stubbornness or because of work, some sent their families away, especially if their houses were closer to the water. A few of those people went to the hotel near the Superdome themselves. A Louisiana state representative was that way. He had never evacuated for a hurricane, and the guy was not about to start now. But his wife and kids did manage to get him to agree to stay at a hotel downtown while they evacuated. A woman named Denise also chose to stay, but for different reasons. Denise's mother worked at Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans, and hospital employees are allowed to stay there during hurricanes. In fact, they ended up being essential personnel, so Denise's mother couldn't leave. Hospitals and their staff were considered essential services. Quote, a very dangerous situation could be created if they were closed and turned people away. Although at this time, higher-ups were concerned about the danger of keeping it open and the types of people it may attract. Hotels and the criminal sheriff's office workers were also designated as essential workers. The prisoners at the parish jail were not being moved. Now, Denise didn't have a car, so she couldn't leave if she wanted to. Her niece was going to evacuate with her mother, but they didn't want them to get trapped on the highway in the storm with a baby. They thought it would be safer to just stay at the hospital. They stayed home during the last hurricane, but sent her niece to the hospital with her baby. To them, it just made sense. The hospital was the safest place to be if you were going to stay in the city. But it was more than that. That's just how these things went. Like I said, the employees for the hospital were essential workers, and all staff members scheduled to work during the hurricane had to sign in by noon, get their room assignments, and pick up wristbands. Denise wasn't the only family member planning to stay at Memorial. There were at least 460 Memorial employees and over 440 family members with those employees, many of whom brought pets, even though they were not really supposed to. Memorial employees parked their cars in the multi-story parking garage connected to the hospital, expecting the street would flood, and brought trunks they packed of at least 3 days' worth of hurricane provisions into the hospital. Pets in their kennels were taken to the medical records department on the hospital's ground floor. Also in the parking garage, suspended from the garage's basement ceiling, a battered metal fishing boat. In the basement, the supplies were kept, including food, medical records, and linens, among other things. Denise, her mother, her niece, and her niece's 2-year-old daughter went to the hospital and were given a room to stay in. But according to Denise, they were later kicked out and their room was given to 2 white nurses. This upset Denise a lot, so she went home and set up her twin bed in the hallway. The hallway because she believed that the best place to be structurally if the building is moving around when there's high winds is the hallway. That's where the hospital would move patients when things got intense anyway. And Denise waited. According to 5 Days at Memorial by Sherry Fink, another major episode source, at Memorial Medical Center, among nearly 200 other Memorial Hospital patients was 79-year-old Johnny Burgess, accompanied by her daughter, Lynette. Lynette made it the night before from the Netherlands after hearing Johnny's uterine cancer spread and couldn't be operated on. Johnny was a licensed practical nurse with 35 years of experience working in New Orleans hospitals and nursing homes before ending up a patient at Memorial, which was, as Sherry Fink put it, an unsettling paradox. Johnny, described as light brown, was able to work and care for patients at private hospitals when she was a practicing nurse, but she couldn't receive care at them. Segregation and racism, and all that being what it is. Memorial was one of the last hospitals to integrate, and they only eventually caved because of financial incentives and newfound non-discrimination statements by the Southern Baptist Convention, which Memorial was part of. It used to be named Southern Baptist Hospital. Integration for the hospital happened in 1970, not too long ago at all. Now, at the hotel by the Superdome and Convention Center, guests could hear an announcement being made at 11:30 p.m. as Hurricane Katrina made landfall. The announcement told guests to place their personal belongings in the bathroom inside of their hotel room, grab blankets and pillows, and make their way to the fourth floor ballroom. At the same time, there were reportedly over 25,000 people in the Superdome, more than 600 of them with special medical needs. For those inside, the atmosphere was described as decent. People were hungry for a while, but representatives did manage to get some food to the people inside. When they were able to get food, people were happy. They wanted to be able to watch TV to follow the news, but for the most part, everyone riding out Katrina's landfall in the Superdome accepted where they were and that the storm was coming. Around 2:30 a.m., now Monday, August 29th, it started to get rough. About 15 minutes prior, listeners could hear an announcer on the radio reporting live how rough the conditions were getting at Memorial Medical Center from his spot on the 6th floor, where winds were much stronger than at ground level, but closer to where many patients were. Patients also had to be moved away from windows and into hallways, if possible. The radio host and field reporter went back and forth, speculating how much the hospital's windows could take. Neither knew the answer. The hurricane sounded like a freight train, similar to a tornado, so loud you couldn't hear yourself think after a few hours of the noise. Around 4:30 a.m., Susan Mulderick, the director of nursing at Memorial and head of the Emergency Preparedness Committee / designated incident commander for Katrina, was startled awake to a loud crack. She was sleeping in her office with her family members, and they all rushed to grab their belongings and run out of the office as fast as they could into the hallway. Susan's mother was 76 and had never moved that fast. Susan slammed the door to her office behind them. As soon as they were out, the window completely shattered as the door closed, and she barely managed to protect anyone passing from flying glass. She had worked at the hospital for 32 years and had almost 2 decades of experience directing nursing departments and being part of the hospital emergency committee that she now led. Less than 30 minutes later, the power from the city to the hospital failed, but the hospital's generators kicked on. Unfortunately, the generators were only meant to keep on critical equipment, emergency lights, and a few outlets on each floor. There was no air conditioning, so box fans had to be used on patients, but there weren't nearly enough to go around. Around 5 o'clock in the morning, Denise, who left Memorial and was back home, was startled in bed when the ceiling began falling down around her. They lived on the 2nd floor, so she was scared the floor would actually fall through and ending up injured down below where no one would find her. She said she was riding the bed like a horse and so terrified she had never been that scared for that long. There was water pouring through the ceiling. People were calling her phone and telling her she should have stayed at the hospital. In an interview on This American Life, she said her heart was in her throat while she feared for her life for 8 entire hours. Now, those spending the night in the Superdome were woken around 6 in the morning to what was described as a New York subway train or someone hammering on the roof. They sat there and watched as part of the roof was ripped off and rain started pouring in. About 30 minutes after that, most of New Orleans lost power. Phone service would go out a few hours later. At 8 a.m., Hurricane Katrina struck New Orleans, with winds hitting 135 miles per hour and a storm surge of 18 feet. Almost immediately, there were reports of waves topping levees. Around 9 a.m., Uptown residents heard a big boom. People who lived and stayed in the Ninth Ward heard multiple booms. The explosions were so loud that some people thought it was the end of the world. They could literally feel the blast. Others thought it could have been a transformer, but that wouldn't really make sense because the power had been out for hours at that point. Most people had been sitting in the dark for at least 3 hours, so to them, it didn't make sense to hear multiple explosions. But I'll have to explain more on that later. Because then, the water came. At some point, the hospital basement at Memorial began flooding. This wouldn't be the first time this happened. It shouldn't have been a surprise. With up to 5 days' worth of food stashed there, 7 if they rationed, Susan Muldrick helped people pack and move supplies from the basement. Pets were moved in an assembly line of hospital volunteers and National Guard soldiers from the flood zone to the 8th floor into old, unused surgical suites. Some National Guard members had been sent to the city prior to the hurricane hitting and sent help to certain places. 10 patients in Memorial's emergency room on the 1st floor were also moved sometime after. The command center Susan Muldrick set up on the 1st floor was also moved, but into a nurse training room on the 4th floor. Now, Denise, scared for her life at home, swore the second she could safely get back to the hospital, she would. She'd make a break for it, and that's what she did. The rain and wind lessened by late morning, with water receding by mid-afternoon. Pets and food at Memorial were carried back downstairs. When the worst passed, Denise walked back to the hospital and she saw a lot of people walking around with their kids. Memorial Hospital was surrounded by about 3 feet of water. Inside, people were sharing food and just generally having a good time waiting for an opportunity to go home, which they originally hoped to do that day or the next, as they always had in the past. There were cooks still at the hospital, on staff making food for patients and everyone else as needed. At some point during that Monday, one man who lives in a 2-story apartment near the levees was caught on camera running outside in the pouring rain, in crazy winds, trying to get away. He wasn't quite sure what happened. He didn't know if water came over the levee or what, but all he knew was there was so much water. Too much. The water was too high for him to stay where he lived, so he got up. But not everyone was lucky enough to do so. At another New Orleans hospital, Charity Hospital, there were 360 patients and 1,200 staff trapped inside when Katrina hit. Charity Hospital was a public and teaching hospital known for being the largest public hospital that cared mostly for the poor and needy. It was also one of the busiest trauma centers in America. Staff at Charity that would work through the storm were part of the disaster activation team, and they arrived on site at 7 a.m. the day prior. Charity was in lockdown mode, but they still accepted some special needs patients from the Superdome that was nearby. That night, Charity staff high-fived each other and sighed in relief, believing the worst of it to be over. They made it through the storm, things would be back to normal tomorrow, but as they settled in, they noticed something very wrong. There was no rain, but water kept coming up the hospital's ramp outside. Lots of water was pouring into Gravier Street and rising fast. The following morning, Tuesday, August 30th, Denise went back to her house. She wanted to grab a few important documents, like her Social Security card and similar things like that. She wanted to grab her degrees because she earned them and she wanted to make sure they weren't wet. And she's a smoker, so of course a carton of cigarettes that she knew was somewhere in the house was on that list. She found everything she was looking for and it was all dry because they were in a little purse. Denise went back to the hospital again, where her mother said she wanted to go home to grab hers and everyone else's documents as well. They wouldn't be able to leave and go back home. Some people at Memorial went to a supermarket 8 blocks away and returned with drinks, food, and diapers. There was discourse among those stuck at Memorial on if this was, quote, soul surviving, surviving for the soul, end quote, or looting. They weren't paying for anything, not that there was anyone in stores to pay had that been possible. The stores weren't open. people at Memorial weren't authorized to leave. That morning, Memorial staff had a meeting run by Susan Mulderick. The hospital was shifting from assault mode to survival mode with news that they should expect severe flooding. After the meeting ended, a memo was sent out stating the incident command declared survival mode for Memorial Medical Center. All physicians and staff were to stay at the hospital. Family members were advised to stay too. With the hospital expecting flooding, medically stable patients were discharged, even though they didn't have anywhere to go or a way to get anywhere. Some of them were just placed in the lobby in wheelchairs where they waited. There were to be no PET scans, CTs, MRIs, or elective surgeries. Every department had to report to the command team by noon with a list of available medicine, supplies, equipment, and cell phones because the hospital's landlines were no longer holding a reliable or stable connection. The list also had to include present employees and their family members. With the hospital not being fully staffed, services that were authorized to be done lacked enough experienced hands. Like kidney dialysis. Those in renal failure had to undergo hours of kidney dialysis every few days to remove the fluid from their bodies and clean their blood. Because of the hurricane, the dialysis clinics in the city were closed. Those clients were showing up at Memorial where they only had one dialysis nurse working. A nursing director from the healthcare company, Life Care, and another nurse volunteered to help, and they tutored the kidney specialist. The kidney specialist was a doctor who was used to ordering dialysis, not providing it. The dialysis procedure needed water, but the city water was so heavily contaminated with chemicals and bacteria that it was dangerous to even bathe in, let alone being used on health-compromised patients. The doctor chose to filter the water and hope for the best. The patients wouldn't survive without dialysis, and there was no timetable on when they may be transferred somewhere else. Memorial staff boiled water in the microwave and stockpiled it for other uses, forming an assembly line to hasten the process. Some hospital dwellers at Memorial could see people allegedly ransacking a big box drugstore as well. One Memorial administrator heard from the security advisor that they were locking down the hospital to keep looters out and were under martial law. Quote, so our security officers can shoot to kill if they want, end quote. How seeing others go and grab essential supplies out of an empty store differed from what some of them did earlier? You tell me. The same day, an uptown resident named Michael was in his home. He remembered how on Saturday around noon was when he heard that Katrina was really going to hit them, and his house wasn't hurricane ready. He still had to board up windows and get stuff out of his yard, but he ultimately decided that he was going to stay instead of leave. But now, on Tuesday, he could hear water bubbling in the streets around him. He could hear clinks all around, like clink, 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 all down the street from manhole covers being blown out of the ground and water shooting up out of the sewers, rising rapidly. And the water would stay that high. Michael lived on the second story of his building, and so he could see neighbors on their roofs or in open windows trying to cool off because of how hot it was. Remember, this is the deep south in August. The second the hurricane passed, it was hot again, in the mid to low 90s Fahrenheit or about 32 degrees Celsius, for almost all of the days I'll be talking about from this point on, so keep that in mind. It no doubt felt hotter for those trapped in attics with no way to cool off or escape with how high the floodwater was and no power. Outside of Memorial Hospital, Plant Operations Director and part of the emergency leadership team, Eric Yankovic, took photos to document the hurricane damage. A National Guardsman approached him and told him that the levees protecting New Orleans were breached. The Guardsman told Eric they needed to prepare for 15 feet or about 4.5 meters of water. Eric thought the guy was joking at first, but he refused to bring such dreadful news to the rest of the emergency leadership team without the Guardsman. Once that news was delivered, it led to an emergency mid-morning meeting in the command center. It was so hot and stuffy, someone busted out the windows with a 2-foot metal oxygen tank. Once Susan Mulderick let staff know of the incoming floodwaters, the energy shifted from hospital emergency vibe to military operation because the only thing on everyone's mind was to act before they lost power. Their generators were in an area of the hospital that would no doubt flood. They knew they had almost 200 memorial patients needing to be rescued, and Susan suggested the sickest and most dependent on life support or mechanical aids be sent out first. This included 24 ICU patients, approximately as many newborns, high-risk pregnant women, and about half a dozen dialysis patients, with more showing up. With all of those, they would be among the more difficult to care for if they lost power. With rampant rumors and reports of crime nearby, memorial staff were increasingly nervous and knew they needed help. They had National Guardsmen within the hospital to help with some things, but what they really needed was emergency transport and a definitive plan. And that's what the community relations manager for Katrina at Memorial tried to do. A series of increasingly frantic emails were sent to Memorial's parent company, Tenet Healthcare, asking for guidance and rescue for patients over the next several hours. In the meantime, all available doctors and nurse managers were gathered and informed that they needed to prepare to get patients transferred, sickest first. The head of the internal medicine department reassigned physicians to cover each of the 15 patient wards. Dr. Horace Boltz, an internal medicine specialist and among the longest-serving medical staff members on site, suggested doctors should not see their own private patients anymore unless they were on their newly designated ward. This was supposedly to avoid duplicating work. They had until 4 p.m. to get a count together and designate patients as either ICU, general hospital ward, nursing home, or rehabilitation facility. Patients should be packed up and have their transfer orders made as well. One of these doctors was 61-year-old Ewing Cook, a pulmonologist, and one of the hospital's veteran critical care doctors. Ewing had actually retired from clinical practice and was now a chief medical officer, but he replaced his son, also a doctor, who went home the night before but was unable to return due to flooding. His wife and their daughters were nurses. The whole family practiced medicine. Ewing decided to order everything but the most essential treatments and care to stop, to lighten the amount of work nurses had to do. An internist by the name of Dr. Bryant King decided to kind of disregard that order and ordered a nurse to turn on one of his patient's heart monitors after Ewing ordered it turned off. He was still wanting to submit proper billing paperwork, the works. But when Ewing found out, the guy was furious and told the nurse in front of Bryant, quote, "I'm in charge of this floor. I told you what to do. I don't care what any other doctor says. Do it," end quote. As floodwaters continued rising inside of the hospital, volunteers had to move the provisions and pets that had been moved back to the basement and the first floor when the hurricane passed. Sewage had also started backing up through the drains. Memorial Hospital had a helipad. Pilots could actually turn on the landing lights remotely using their VHF radios, and the lights alerted hospital staff to prepare for an arrival, day or night, in most weather. Unfortunately, the helipad and garage elevators relied on electricity and hadn't been wired to the backup electrical system, so they were useless without power from the city grid. Staff didn't think they could take a patient straight to the helipad from within the hospital. They had to go up a long garage staircase. The helipad was opened in 1985, and what I think will feel ironic later, but was called a time-saving, potentially life-saving feat of logistics. When it was added on top of the 8-story hospital parking garage, the garage elevator was extended 2 floors higher so that it could be accessed from the hospital's emergency room and the maternity unit on the 6th floor. It went mostly unused since added to the point where, at the time Katrina hit 20 years later, it was described as decrepit. The hospital engineers were unsure if it would even hold an aircraft weighing 20,000 pounds like it once could. It recently had $100,000 put into it, only to keep it from collapsing into the parking garage below. Some staff went up to the helipad to check out its functionality and determine if it was possible to have helicopter rescue. One anesthesiologist stayed after everyone else left. He could do that. He was one of the few physicians who didn't have clinical responsibilities anymore, considering they weren't really doing surgeries anymore. The anesthesiologist was still up there looking around at the underwater city when he heard a helicopter. He waved at it, not meaning to signal it to land, but that's essentially what happened. Luckily, the helipad was stronger than it looked and held. The helicopter pilot asked the anesthesiologist if there were people needing evacuation, and the doctor told him yes. The pilot could take a sick newborn. The pilot got permission from his commander to take one, and the doctor ran through the parking garage and into the hospital to tell the incident command team before going up to the neonatal ICU and finding a critically ill baby to transport. By the time the doctor returned to the helipad, the pilot was not happy. It took too long for the guy to return with the baby. He had to go up and down several flights of stairs, get permission, the works. There were thousands of people needing help around New Orleans. Waiting that long wasn't an option. The pilot told the doctor he spoke to his commander during his long wait, and he wouldn't be coming back. They had to figure out a better system. Around mid-afternoon, a National Guard troop hauler was parked on Memorial's emergency room ramp that was partway underwater at this point. The truck's platform was barely higher than the water. Soon they would not be able to continue rescuing patients by road. About a dozen patients were helped onto the open truck bed by hospital staff. They were joined by several nurses who would go with the patients out of the city to a hospital in Nacogdoches, Texas, where hospital leaders had arranged for them to go. 27 more patients were planned to go out the same way when the second truck arrived. At the helipad, things weren't going according to plan. Memorial was expecting the Coast Guard to show up with helicopter transport for their neonatal ICU patients. The babies were placed in transport isolettes, which are large self-contained incubators on wheels that have oxygen tanks, warming pads, battery-powered pumps that administer IV fluids, like everything. The incubator was too tall to be placed on the back of a pickup truck. Staff had to go through the process of pushing the incubator up the garage's down ramp, circling the 9th story, and hauling it up 3 sets of fire escape stairs to get to the helipad. One of the baby's oxygen machines stopped working, so a nurse had to move beside 5 men who were hauling the babies in their equipment and manually deliver oxygen via an inflatable bag through an incubator opening. When they reached the helipad, none of the Coast Guard helicopters they were expecting were there. Allegedly, that afternoon, someone at Memorial had sent approach maps and coordinates to a Coast Guard representative, but pilots from out of town struggled to find Memorial. The helipad hadn't been certified for use in years. Like I said, it had hardly been used, in the 20 years it was there. Not to mention, the helipad was marked with SBH from Memorial's old name, Southern Baptist Hospital, which was probably confusing. The babies and staff accompanying them waited for helicopters in the covered wind tunnel. There was a power outlet from the hospital generator used to plug in incubators being used, but things were getting stressful because the babies were obviously getting hot, and one was having complications that might need urgent surgery to resolve. If the power went out before the babies got out, they wouldn't survive. But all the hospital was currently receiving were small private helicopters that weren't willing to take sick neonates needing specialized care. Sick elderly patients? Yes. Babies? No. Especially with some of the helicopters not even being able to fit the incubators inside. With them running low on backup oxygen tanks, time running out before they lost their backup power, and it taking 45 minutes on average to move patients to the helipad from the hospital with the elevator that they could hear the shaft of filling up with water, Doctors aiding the NICU operation feared the babies were running out of time. Dr. Richard Dykman, the internal medicine department chairman, was directing movements on the helipad with a two-way radio to communicate with other hospital employees. The neonatologist, Dr. Juan Gershonick, pleaded with Richard to convince small private helicopters to take the NICU patients. There wasn't much Richard could do, though. He couldn't force private pilots to take patients they didn't feel comfortable transporting, knowing they needed extra hands and care. There were still at least the 2 babies that needed incubators, but they wouldn't fit into the helicopter. No one thought they would survive being transported without them. Dr. Juan Gershonick didn't think there was much of a choice, though. He took one baby, baby boy S, born at 24 weeks and a 6-week-old preemie at this point, out of the incubator and into his arms. The neonatologist used a reinflating bag to breathe for baby boy S instead, as they both loaded into the passenger side of a helicopter. A nurse jumped into the back seat with the second baby and slid the baby under her scrub shirt. The cold draft blasting through the helicopter as they flew scared Juan as he tried to use his body to protect baby boy S from the cold. It was getting dark out by this time, and his concern was dislodging the tubing in the baby's windpipe. He was using the bag to pump air into without realizing it. He didn't have any of the usual equipment to keep track of baby boy S's vital signs, and the helicopter was way too loud for a stethoscope to be used for hearing breathing noises. The only way to really tell if the baby was alive was to use one of his hands to pinch the baby's foot and see if he withdrew it or not. The entire flight, the neonatologist was sick with worry over if he made the right choice or not. But the guy did know one thing. If baby boy S survived, he would never complain about anything again. Sickeningly enough, soon after that silent promise, the pilot said he had to stop for fuel. What was supposed to be a 5-minute stop stretched to about 30 minutes before the doctor began loudly protesting to the pilot. He knew if the babies didn't get out of there soon, they wouldn't make it. He could see helicopters that landed after them leave well before them. The pilot reminded him the other pilots were rescuing others stranded on rooftops who would also die without help. It sobered the doctor up. The impression I got from Sherry Fink's reporting of Memorial staff's accounts, it's like they forgot that there were other people in need of help or in worse condition, which will prove to be a dire point of view later on. Now, the neonatologist apologized for his impatience while switching oxygen tanks and realizing that while he was only advocating for his patients, as doctors do, the ongoing battle to save lives went beyond him and his patients. It went beyond Memorial Hospital. Baby boy S would make it to their destination fine, with his vital signs matching what they had been when he was on machines. In the meantime, ICU neonatal nurses on the helipad at Memorial had been waving down passing helicopters. The doctors and staff had gotten kind of desperate to get some patients on flights, with one doctor actually arguing with a Coast Guard pilot about how many patients the guy could fit in his helicopter. He left to go rescue people somewhere else. A former Air Force captain, now nurse, saw the clashing of doctors and experienced pilots with more than enough logged search and rescue flight hours and training to be arguing with Memorial staff, and cleared it with Dr. Richard Dykman, the chairman of medical services, managing things from the roof, to manage the helipad herself. The nurse made staff go wait in the wind tunnel and got to work. Memorial staff, now down to the last of the critically ill babies being loaded on a helicopter, when the pilot of it said they had a flight plan for west of Baton Rouge instead of the agreed-upon hospital that said that they would accept Memorial's neonatal patients. The nurses didn't want this and didn't know for sure if the new hospital even had the setup necessary for their NICUs. Richard said the babies could leave and will be taken to wherever the pilot is going because this is a disaster. The neonatal nursing director threatened to take the babies off the helicopter and told Richard as much, which was an upset because of whatever unspoken rule that doctors are on top in the hospital hierarchy. The nurse told Richard the pilot needed to find a way to go to their agreed-upon hospital or he wasn't taking the babies. The pilot quickly got approval for a new flight plan, and word came back a few hours later that the babies arrived safely at the same location as baby boy S. Now, while the neonatal staff were battling to get babies on flights, other pilots arriving would only accept those elderly patients. The amount of time and effort it took to bring elderly patients that private helicopters would take for transport to the helipad led to anyone with a do not resuscitate or DNR order to be put last for evacuation. DNR means if your breathing or heartbeat stops, you won't be revived. It doesn't mean that you have a certified, irreversible, or terminal condition and are slated for death. All it means is that if your body stops functioning the way it should to sustain life, they won't do CPR, which is incredibly painful for a healthy adult, let alone elderly or ill individuals. They won't do extraordinary measures to keep you around. If your body dies, that's it. DNR orders have to be signed by a doctor with the informed consent of the patient or healthcare proxy. Again, because this is important, it does not mean the patient is expected to drop dead and is okay with it or has the least to lose or should be written off. They just don't want to go through the pain of having their ribs broken during compressions, a tube shoved down their throat, to be intubated, so on and so forth, with the pain associated with reviving people and prolonging life. Not give up and just let them die. It's just, if they die, don't bring them back. Now, while the helipad was going through their situation, nurses were inside the hospital running around, moving box stands from patient to patient. When they received calls to hurry up and bring up elderly patients, they couldn't wait for the one working elevator that was slowly flooding. They rolled patients onto blankets and had volunteers help carry them downstairs for several flights in dark stairwells. Flashlights were held in mouths to help light the way and sometimes taped to stairway railings when time permitted. Meanwhile, in front of Memorial, the task of getting patients loaded onto those National Guard trucks had wrapped up, and an elderly patient inside Memorial died after attempts to resuscitate them failed. The man was a life care patient. Life care was on the 7th floor of Memorial, and it occupied 3 hallways on the floor, north, south, and west. The east hallway was for Memorial's marketing department. The company itself provided long-term treatment to very sick, typically elderly and debilitated patients. A lot of them were at life care for rehabilitation to reach the goal of breathing on their own since they required mechanical ventilators. Once they did, they would be returned to nursing facilities or back to their homes. They had several other locations, 2 others in the area. Most of the patients from those single-story locations were moved into the company's location within Memorial Hospital. Others were sent to different hospitals prior to Katrina making landfall. Life care, even the location inside of the hospital for the past 8 years, wasn't hospice, which prioritizes comfort and quality of life by reducing pain and suffering for typically terminally ill patients or those with incurable conditions, comfort instead of curing. But life care had its own staff, pharmacists, nurses, administrators, and supply chain. 40-year-old Gina Isbell was a registered nurse and the nursing director at Life Care's now likely underwater facility in St. Bernard Parish. Before the forecast was official that Katrina would be a huge storm to hit New Orleans, Gina and her higher-ups decided to move patients. It would be a nightmare to wait and see if they would need to once it was closer to being too late. She had assigned an A team of nurses that would help her at Memorial and a B team that would replace them once the storm passed. The A team were strong nurses and team players that she wanted with her during the inevitably stressful situation Katrina might present. They volunteered to work during that time. Many of the doctors on staff at Memorial also had patients in life care. That elderly patient that could not be resuscitated was under pulmonologist Dr. John Thiel's care. John used to be partnered with Dr. Ewing Cook before Ewing retired. John received part of his medical training at Charity Hospital, where he learned to attend to the most critical patients first. When he checked on the elderly patient late that morning, his condition was stable, but as the man was pronounced, Dr. John Thiel was elsewhere. The truth is, allegedly, no one wanted responsibility for the 7th floor when the wards were divided between physicians to check on and evacuate patients. The doctors that admitted the most patients to life care weren't at Memorial when Katrina hit. And allegedly, those that were there didn't want high care patients added to their roster that weren't their direct responsibility. But that part is for another time. Life care staff were shocked that Memorial doctors didn't feel more of a duty to care for life care patients. At one meeting, a senior life care manager, nurse, executive asked doctors, "What about us?" In response, a female doctor gave the nurse her phone number and where she would be located while telling her, quote, "Don't call me for a runny nose," end quote. A male doctor responded to that doctor saying, quote, "You don't have to do that. You're not under any obligation at all," end quote. Even Dr. Roy Collada pressured life care staff to make more room for his grandmother when her nursing home announced they wouldn't evacuate before the storm. Allegedly, it didn't sound like he took much, if any, time really to oversee life care patients, though. As for the elderly life care patient, the doctor that did show up at that time was Dr. Anna Poe, who did have patients in life care, but who was outside helping load patients onto the National Guard truck. Anna was asked by nurses to help with the resuscitation effort the second she stepped back inside the hospital and was informed of the code blue. There were no doctors on the floor. Anna ran up 6 flights of stairs, not wanting to wait on the one operational elevator, and took over. The man was intubated by Anna before an ER doctor showed up and took over. Dr. Anna Poe was not an ER doctor. She was a head and neck surgeon, usually providing surgery to find and remove cancer in those areas and reconstruct. She was not typically trying to revive patients on a normal day. At the same time, one patient in Memorial's ICU was 77-year-old Helen Breckenridge, who had been at Memorial for approximately a week. She was there after developing complications of diabetes and heart and lung disease. Helen was in hospice care at another hospital, but her brother, a physician at another New Orleans hospital, didn't feel she was being cared for properly there. He had her transferred to Memorial for aggressive treatment after a court battle to prove she was forced to sign paperwork that led to her hospice admittance. But at this point in time, Helen Breckenridge was the current Memorial patient being moved by a team of staff downstairs from the 8th floor. Unfortunately, after laboring to move her downstairs while one person bagged air into her lungs, they were ordered to bring her back upstairs. Helen would be a casualty of the reestablished rescue protocol, placing those with do not resuscitate orders last, regardless of health status. Karen Wynn, the nurse manager, Susan Mulderick, Memorial's nursing director, and other nurses were allegedly informed of this shift in mindset to the most salvageable patients had to go from Doctors Ewing Cook and Roy Collada. By the time Helen Breckenridge was returned to the ICU, she was in poor condition. She was put back on her machinery and ventilators, but passed quickly after. Helen was one of 4 DNR patients in the ICU. At Charity Hospital, Tuesday started with everyone waking to a flooded basement and the usual generators being knocked out. Staff were forced to use 10 portable diesel-powered generators and a few oxygen-powered ventilators that they just got a week prior to the storm by Ed Halton. Ed was an emergency medicine doctor at Charity who was in charge of the hospital's disaster preparedness. With the water in the basement getting higher, it was decided that the approximately 50 ER patients on the first floor would be moved to the auditorium on Charity's 2nd floor. The entirety of the hospital was going to be evacuated too. This was all agreed on during an emergency meeting that morning. Charity doctors had to rely on training and instincts for treatment because their monitors were useless. The lab was no longer operational, along with the x-ray machine's operating room. Charity patients were labeled according to the severity of their condition. Green for patients who were all right and could hold their own. Yellow for sick patients that did not require constant attention, and red was used for the most critical patients. The chief resident in Charity's ER, Mike Odinet, and his staff expeditiously worked to strap patients to backboards and carry them and all the supplies they could up the stairs to the auditorium. Many of those patients had to be manually ventilated. Charity staff and patients waited the entirety of Tuesday for trucks and boats to show up so that they could evacuate, which never did. By that night, the ER was empty, but patients were getting sicker. Those needing dialysis hadn't received it in 2 days. No one had left the hospital. As far as patients go, Charity's restrooms were overflowing, sewage backed up everywhere in New Orleans. The hospital's restrooms were absolutely rank, and it was insanely hot. Patients couldn't really get comfortable, and the diesel generators were running low on fuel. Wednesday at Charity started that morning with the chief of the medical intensive care unit, Ben Debois-Blanc, deciding he was going to do something about their situation. You could feel the despair setting in for everyone, and Charity staff were noticeably showing it. Ben was in charge of overseeing all of Charity's red-tagged patients, those in the most critical condition. Pissed off nurses and residents agreed with Dr. Ben Debois-Blanc and decided if they were going to get out, it would be up to them to rescue themselves. They made calls to the news media on their almost dead phones and managed to get an interview that streamed online. It was seen by the owner of an air ambulance company. The owner called Ben and told him he had 4 helicopters in the air on their way to Charity. All they needed to do was get 4 of their sickest patients to the helipad, and they'd take it from there. Charity Hospital didn't have a helipad like Memorial. The closest one was 2 blocks away at Tulane University Hospital on the roof of their parking garage. The water outside was chest deep. Ben managed to flag down a passing boat and got a ride to Tulane and got the green light to use their helipad. Now, to get back to Charity after doing that, he found a National Guard truck that wasn't actively on an assignment and convinced the driver to take him back to the hospital and transport the 4 patients back to the helipad. The patients were 2 female patients with severe head injuries, a 23-year-old man with a condition that caused bleeding in the lungs, Goodpasture syndrome, and a man in acute liver failure. On the way to the helipad, the guy with Goodpasture syndrome started going downhill. Ben had to cut a hole in his chest and stick a tube in to let out air that collapsed his lung. Without anesthesia, the guy survived, but when they made it to the garage, Charity doctors had to manually bag the patients for at least an hour and a half before the first helicopter showed up and took the 23-year-old who needed intervention on the way there. 2.5 hours after that, the other 3 patients, along with Ben and a few other physicians, were waiting for the rest of the helicopters in the dark, still manually bagging patients. He managed to get a call out to the air ambulance owner to ask where the rest of the helicopters were. The guy told him they had been dispatched, grabbed patients, and left. They got the wrong patients, and what I can only assume means they went to another hospital or something by mistake. During this time, things were happening at Charity that weren't unfamiliar with what was happening in the minds of many people in and outside of New Orleans. 71-year-old Dr. Lala Dunbar was in her 13th office floor sweeping up glass from a broken window and gathering papers and files that had been tossed and thrown around by Katrina. Around 10 a.m., Lala and a colleague were looking out the window and towards the hospital roof. They could see some doctors out there. They had slept on Charity's roof to get away from the overwhelming heat inside. Lala could feel the strong wind and then heard a loud roar of a military chopper hovering over the roof. The chopper's doors opened. About a dozen men armed to the teeth, Special Forces soldiers jumped out onto the roof and pointed their weapons at her. They shouted at her to get against the wall and put her hands in the air, but Lala said she knew she was innocent enough of any crime that they weren't looking for her, so she walked herself right up to the window and asked, quote, "What's up? What are you guys here for?" End quote. The person in charge said they heard there were hostages being held by a sniper in the hospital. Lala asked if they were sure it was charity because they heard about sniper fire at Tulane. The guy got on his radio and spoke to someone before he and his men took off down the stairs with Lala. They ran into Charity's chief of emergency and hyperbaric medicine, and special forces pushed the guy against the wall, hands up, and searched him. The doctor would later say it was a strange feeling. By late Wednesday, hope was at an all-time low, and most people at Charity were as scared as many who listened to and believed the rumor mill. Charity was pretty much cut off from the outside world, like many places, and the rumors that they did hear circulated like wildfire, with one doctor saying, quote, "I heard rumors of cannibalism, disaster sex, a nurse being raped, and a man roaming the halls with guns, none of which was true." End quote. Everything from radio broadcasts to TV reporting repeated scary, violent, and sometimes improbable stories of crime in and around New Orleans. Many who tuned in truly believed it. Security became a huge concern. Charity doctors carried guns on their hip because even though they had their own police force, granted they couldn't cover every entrance 24/7, Charity staff were becoming increasingly uneasy and down knowing there were rumors of extreme crime happening. I mean, special forces just dropped onto their roof thinking a sniper was holding people hostage days after a hurricane. And they knew they were not high on the evacuation priority list, being a public hospital and all. They knew private hospitals were being evacuated at a steady pace, faster than them. They were more than aware of the constant helicopters landing at Tulane, while not even a third of Charity's patients and only a few of the staff had gotten out by Wednesday night. It made more than a few people at Charity feel abandoned. Others understood the gravity of the situation. Now, after several more hours of waiting, with patients needing to be bagged the entire time, Dr. Ben Debois-Blanc grew too frustrated to continue semi-patiently waiting and made his way up the ramp to the roof where they were waiting for helicopters. He talked to the guy directing helicopter traffic and begged him to get another pilot on the radio with an SOS. Whatever he did worked. A military chopper eventually arrived, and the 3 remaining patients were flown to a nearby freeway and placed into ambulances, where a fleet of them were waiting. Then the chopper flew Ben back to Tulane and left. By this point, it was now early Thursday morning, and while those 4 patients had made it out, there were over 40 critically ill patients still left among the 300 plus remaining at Charity. But whatever he was able to do was much better than simply waiting. During this time, over at Memorial Medical Center, after midnight on Wednesday, August 31st, the 4th day for many there, the Memorial ICU nurses congratulated each other on the 8th floor because they managed to get out all of their non-DNR patients safely, despite the mental and physical challenges. There were now 2 DNR ICU patients that remained, and there were 2 nurses caring for them. Some staff arranged mattresses, and employees and their family members gathered to pass around an oxygen mask. They let it cool their faces and took hits of the gas. In the command center, the phones kept ringing. Well, the cell phones that worked. The Coast Guard members wanted to continue with rescue overnight, especially knowing that there were 7 life care patients on ventilators at Memorial. The water was still rising, and there was likely going to be power lost in a few hours when their generators failed. Dr. Richard Dykeman, the Internal Medical Services chairman, was asked what to tell the Coast Guard via a security guard sent by another doctor. Richard said to have the Coast Guard send the helicopters for life care patients in the morning. He felt it was too dangerous to reopen the helipad. Susan Muldrick, Memorial's incident commander, knew that Diane Robichaud, Life Care's incident commander, and her staff would need extra hands to get the most critical patients downstairs safely. Susan said the men she would offer to help had already gone to bed, so Diane agreed to wait until lights started shining outside. In theory, this gave time for a better transition for patients as well, because there would be more time for life care to send ambulances to pick up patients and take them to other life care hospitals. Not that I think Memorial's incident commander was actually thinking about that. Now, at the same time, trying to keep generators running was another battle in and of itself. None of the electricians or engineers on site at Memorial were generator mechanics. The generators were not made to be used for prolonged periods, not even 3 days worth of time, and they had been going for 2. One of the generators had already shut down, which left part of the hospital without power. Efforts to refuel, rewire, and repair the generators as they died one by one proved futile. They were underwater, and if they knew what repairs to do, the repairs failed. After 2 hours trying to save the generators, now about 2 a.m. on Wednesday, just 48 hours after Katrina made landfall near New Orleans, the last of the backup generators surged and died. Journalist and author Sherry Fink wrote, quote, "The sudden silence struck Dr. Ewing Cook, lying in his office on the 2nd floor trying to rest, as the sickest sound of his life." End quote. As alarms sounded to the power loss and lights flashed, many different things were happening on different floors inside of Memorial Medical Center. On the 8th floor, Karen Wen, Memorial nurse manager, got up on a chair and used her shoe to hit an alarm panel to shut it up. She then told her nurses to try and get some sleep. On the 7th, where life care was located, special mattresses deflated, the company's computer lost its connection and consequent ability to text corporate, but machines breathing 4 patients on life support still operated. They would stop when the ventilator's battery backups died. On the 5th floor, decisions were being made. A night shift nurse who was still keeping up with electronic charts before computer batteries died was carrying a cell phone that belonged to a nurse whose husband was stationed with the Coast Guard. The phone rang with information that 3 helicopters had been sent to Memorial, but someone kept waving them away. The nurse took the phone downstairs to the command team and gave the phone to a nursing director. After speaking with the Coast Guard member, the director brought the phone back and told the night nurse not to bring it down again because the guy calling was not part of their evacuation plan. The night nurse went back upstairs and the phone rang again. It was a Coast Guard lieutenant and a Louisiana Health Department official. The lieutenant ordered her to ignore what she was told and take the phone immediately to someone in charge, so again, she went back downstairs to give the phone to the same nursing director. The woman berated her as she took the phone. A male doctor informed the night nurse no more patients were being evacuated because it was too hard to see, no power and all. The night nurse suggested placing flashlights in the stairwell, easy enough to do. She was ignored. She went back to the 5th floor and the phone rang again. Another Coast Guard lieutenant, but more senior on the line this time. Again, wanting to speak to a hospital leader. The nurse who had been going up and down the stairs, Michelle Petrie Royale, passed the phone off to the spouse of a nurse for him to take back downstairs. She wanted to go take care of her patients, and quite frankly, she says that she was entirely in disbelief that hospital leaders were actually going back and forth like this with the freaking Coast Guard for trying to send rescuers. She allegedly told another nurse something foreshadowing, quote, "With these people in charge, we may very well die here," end quote. She may have sensed how right she was, only it would allegedly be patients who weren't safe. Susan would eventually go up to the helipad in the dark of the night to see what was going on. Up there were non-patients, people who took shelter at the hospital before the storm. Several dozen people were up there, a line snaking through the stairwell, the wind tunnel, and onto the landing pad. A nurse leader on the helipad was the one waving her arms over her head. She thought she was signaling to the pilots instead of waving them off. She had waved off 3 before a National Guard member at the command center in Alexandria heard what was happening and managed to get in contact with someone who would pass the phone to the nurse and tell her that when the helicopters show up, she needs to stand clear. The person at command was aware of the life care patients needing rescue, and she wanted to get them out of there while there were pilots available and before conditions got worse in the hospital. She knew one ventilator patient had already died. The Coast Guard auxiliary member had been trying to get Susan Muldrick on the phone to keep her up to the minute on helicopter movements, but couldn't reach her. Even though her and 2 colleagues were participating in a complex game of telephone, with then maintaining contact with 3 phones at Memorial, talking to air stations, and using high-frequency radio patches to speak to flight crew over New Orleans that tasked helicopter pilots. When pilots did show up, before being confusedly waved away, they didn't see patients on the helipad. When Susan made it to the helipad, the Coast Guard flight mechanic on the helicopter landed but kept his rotors running and asked if there was food and water and if it was dry in the hospital. Susan replied, saying yes. The guy told her, "You've got food, so you need to stay here, because where I would take y'all is not good. We're dumping you in a field with no infrastructure, set up at Cloverleaf. It's a spot on the highway that looks like Woodstock after the concert." Civilians were better off staying at Memorial. Both Susan and the mechanic then looked over to see a patient being carried up the steps, which was dangerous because untrained people were doing it. Not to mention, they barely had lighting. Workers went to the patient to manually ventilate her. The woman had to be resuscitated on the way to the helipad and needed to go straight to a Baton Rouge hospital. The helicopter didn't have enough fuel for that, though. It had been on the helipad for a long time now. A doctor desperately threatened the flight crew with leaving the patient alone on the helipad if they wouldn't take her, so the pilot agreed. They would take the woman to the New Orleans Coast Guard Air Station to be transferred to another aircraft. The helicopter left at 5:15 a.m., with the nurse accompanying the woman inside. The nurse was too scared to actually do her job, though, so the rescue swimmer, part of the Coast Guard rescue teams, had to take over, keeping the woman alive. Before the pilot left, Susan told them not to come back. Just before 6 a.m., Susan's choice to stop air rescues reached the Coast Guard's Alexandria Command Center. By that point, only 3 short trips had happened that rescued just 3 of Life Care's ventilated patients and 1 on a special oxygen device. 2 of those rescued patients were on the same flight. The flight to rescue them left for Memorial Medical Center several hours earlier, leaving Mobile, Alabama, around 3:30 a.m., a town also hit by Katrina. That Coast Guard Air Training Station had also received calls for assistance to Memorial's powerless hospital where patients needed help. That aircraft could take 2 ventilator patients at once. By the time they made it, hospital staff and patients were ready to go. The rescue swimmer, part of this flight crew, unloaded ready-to-go meals and bottled water from the helicopter onto the deck and told a doctor they needed to nurse themselves or they wouldn't do anybody any good. He also gave the doctor a cell phone-sized Coast Guard drop radio that could be used to access their emergency channel. When the flight left with the 2 patients, the swimmer spent the hour-plus flight praying, bagging, and monitoring the patient's vital signs. Inside of the hospital, where staff weren't aware Susan had suspended air rescue for the rest of the night, ventilator-reliant life care patients were carried downstairs and lined up for their chance to be rescued. After 1 patient passed through the hole in the wall into the garage, a life care respiratory therapist heard someone say, quote, "They needed more viable patients. Y'all can't keep bringing patients like this to us," end quote. Which was offensive, especially to the therapist, whose patients were just like this. Now, the Coast Guard member in Alexandria wanted to continue rescues throughout the night. get all of their sicker patients out of there that they could. LifeCare's remaining ventilator patients especially. Memorial nurses told the woman they were tired. It was hard to move patients in the dark. The woman at the station in Alexandria couldn't wrap her mind around them wanting to stop. She had pilots and places for the patients to go if the Memorial staff would just get patients to the roof. Memorial nurses told her the rest of the patients were DNRs and operations had to stop for now. They could continue at 9 a.m. Now, that wasn't true. Not all of the patients on ventilators had do not resuscitate orders. A male Coast Guard volunteer beside that auxiliary member in Alexandria had a hard time understanding Memorial staff's decision. It took the guy hours working with that woman to find hospitals that would take the patients, and nearly as long to even get hospital leaders to agree and go along with it. He worked as each generator failed at Memorial. He was shocked when a hospital leader told him their priority was evacuating their own patients. The woman's responsibility was to them, not LifeCare's sickest patients, another company. That volunteer pretended to speak to a superior about the choice to abandon the rescue until morning and told that auxiliary member, no, she's going to take the most critical patients out first. The woman told him it was her choice to make, and he told her it wasn't. I mean, it wasn't his either, but he couldn't possibly care less. He just knew this was the wrong call and couldn't imagine how that choice wouldn't haunt the woman later. Around this time, a sitter hired by son Mark LeBlanc and daughter-in-law Sandra to 82-year-old Elvira LeBlanc, who went by Vera, grew worried. The sitter had been in contact with Sandra and told her that morning around 4 a.m. about the heat. It was so hot, nurse manager Karen Wynn had previously worried about elderly patients having heat strokes. The sitter informed Sandra the nurses at Memorial were starting to freak out. People were dying and there wasn't anywhere to put their remains. The sitter started to get desperate, asking Sandra when the woman was coming for her mother-in-law. The LeBlancs lived in New Orleans, and they had to evacuate to northern Louisiana and stayed with relatives until the storm passed. Vera stayed at the hospital. When Sandra and Mark heard the city flooded, they decided to come back and started the journey on Tuesday. They had to rescue Mark's mother, Vera, and her sitter. The LeBlancs got volunteer identification badges from Louisiana's Bureau of Emergency Medical Services in Baton Rouge. Sandra formally administered state EMT exams, so she had a very loose government connection in that sense. She registered at the EMS registration desk before finding out where they should go. She was told of a triage center on a freeway just west of New Orleans, and she agreed to go there. Sandra had left her EMS credentials before the hurricane, so without it, the couple probably wouldn't be able to actually get clear of those checkpoints that the government set up to keep outsiders out of the area. So the LeBlancs went to a fire station 40 miles from New Orleans, trying to join the firefighters there, forming rescue crews. They waited all day to be sent to replace those in the city that were growing tired, but they were never contacted to replace anyone. Closer to the evening, some firefighters and their chief just chose to drive to the triage spot, so Sandra and Mark joined them. They made it to the Cloverleaf Highway interchange at Causeway Boulevard, west of New Orleans, and immediately thousands of people were seen standing, sitting, or lying on the ground with debris and downed light poles. Sandra thought it was unfathomable. It looked like a war zone, and they could see helicopters lower and let people out again and again onto the ground. There was this concept, Hurricane Pam, a government experiment/plan that I'll dive into on another part because it needs it, but they never finished actually developing the plan at this time. They failed to provide buses and drivers to pick people up being dropped at this spot as pilots followed that plan. The search and rescue base of operations let pilots quickly loop in and out of the flood zone, so people were being rescued from rooftops and wherever pilots could see them and get to them, but then they were being left there with nowhere to go and no way to get there. Well, at least out of the city anyway. Sandra found the leader of an ambulance company, yelling into his phone about how he needed water, food, bathrooms, buses, cots, every freaking thing, because they pretty much had nothing and not enough for who was already there, let alone the rescues that would continue to be dropped there. Sandra helped some former students in the meantime. She recognized and examined injured people and got them into ambulances that they needed to go to Baton Rouge. Now, even though Sandra listened to them share their stories and news about how they'd experienced a terrifyingly scary day and night stuck on their own roofs with none of the things they desperately needed, not even water, she turned away someone asking for water for their mother when requested. If she gave them some, she would have had to give everyone some, and the medical teams were hiding their food and water as it was. They wouldn't have water to take care of people. So it would be at this point, 4 in the morning on Wednesday, when Sandra got the message from the sitter with her mother-in-law, and the desperation was palpable. Sandra informed EMS officials, and the frantic call that nurses at Memorial Hospital were starting to panic was recorded in EMS logs around 5 that morning. Unfortunately for the LeBlancs, Memorial Hospital was now second priority. Memorial's best hope was now her going to find a good launch point with a fleet of boats and help at sunrise to go empty the hospital herself. The LeBlancs found 2 Cajun men with airboats and heard some would be sent to the hospital. Now, when it was announced where boats should head to help clear out hospitals, Memorial wasn't mentioned. When Sandra asked why, the official didn't know. Sandra couldn't wrap her head around the fact that her mother-in-law's sitter sounded that desperate for help. People were dying, but the hospital hadn't even made the list for assistance. How and why was this possible? Unless other hospitals were that much worse off. The 2 Cajun men told the LeBlancs that they would go help them rescue Memorial patients and staff if they led the way. They loaded the airboats onto trucks and drove to Claiborne Avenue and launched the boats from there. People trekking through the neck-deep floodwater waved them down, trying to catch rides or get help, but Mark and Sandra only yelled back where dry land was and that they couldn't stop because they were on their way to the hospital. 2 aluminum boats joined them on their way to Memorial. At Memorial, an 80-year-old Korean War veteran, John Russell, was now needing hand ventilation. He was found breathing around 5:30 a.m., just hours after the generators failed. He was intubated and given medication to restore a livable heart rhythm before being carried downstairs. That's where Gina Isbell, LifeCare's director of nursing, stood manually bagging John Russell to help him breathe. Gina bagged him for about an hour in the hot corridor before John moved to the machine room in line to the helipad. He had been twitching and mostly unresponsive for a while now. I guess a sign that he wasn't getting enough oxygen to his brain. Gina's hands were tired. A physician passing John stopped and flashed a light into his eyes to check his neurological function before telling Gina that she knew John needed oxygen. She confirmed, of course she knew this. The doctor told her they didn't have any more oxygen and couldn't get any, so she had to let him go. This wasn't true. There was oxygen in the hospital. Allegedly, Gina didn't know this, or that the ICU nurses had passed around an oxygen mask just hours prior, even though at this point in me telling the story, it felt like days. Allegedly, the doctor would have been more likely to know where tanks were, but it's also likely he didn't think searching for the tanks was worth it if he thought John was too far gone, that the oxygen should be saved for others, that the man would not last long enough for helicopter rescue, or that searching for oxygen tanks just wasn't practical. Might sound like a huge conclusion for me to jump to. After all, I don't know the man. I wasn't there, but that's some of the ideas Sherry Fink proposed, and that's why this is a multi-part retelling of Katrina. There's so much more that I have to tell you just to get the entire jaded picture. Now, the problem was recorded in the state's emergency services logs a few hours later, saying Baptist Hospital has now run out of O2. Priority has been given to moving their vent patients. Gina believed the doctor, though, and after spending a moment considering how could she just give up on this patient, she just stopped squeezing his bag. She hugged John Russell and ran her hands through his hair while he died. Gina then covered his face with the sheet and moved him from the machine room before sitting on the ground near his feet to wait for a life care nurse executive to direct her where to take his remains. The 8th floor morgue was probably full and not refrigerated anymore. After an hour, the hospital chaplain, another John, but last name Mars, approached Gina and guided her and the gurney to the chapel where she moved chairs to make space. Gina allegedly cried into the chaplain's arms. To her, this death felt very different. Now, after crying and sitting alone in the chapel, she and the chaplain went to Gina's car on the 4th floor of the parking garage and sat in the car blasting air conditioning. Dr. Anna Poe spent the overnight hours at Memorial bagging a life care patient, switching with 2 other staff while they waited. When she made it back to the patient, they had passed. At some point, Anna realized something Susan Muldrick and others had concluded earlier. The remaining sick patients weren't likely to get out of Memorial alive. Memorial staff members came up to announce patients with do not resuscitate orders couldn't go. One patient had died being carried down the staircase, but another had never even left Life Care's floor. The last 5 patients reliant on ventilators would not survive this stay at Memorial. As the sun rose, the heat in Memorial was stifling. The toilets were backed up, and the smell meshed with the stench of hundreds of unwashed, sweaty bodies and human remains. Water was no longer flowing from the taps. Soon after, the sound of airboats moving towards the hospital was heard. Inside one of them was Sandra LeBlanc and her husband Mark. When they made it to Memorial, Mark borrowed a flashlight from staff and went up 7 flights of stairs to life care through the sweltering heat. Inside, nurses were not tending to patients. They appeared worn down and stood around a desk. The patients were almost naked. Mark found his mother, Vera, lying on a wet bed and covered in sweat. She smiled at him and told him she was thirsty and in a mess, which upset Mark. Sandra and Mark took care of Vera and then found someone who could tell them what was going on. They found the floor's senior leader, Diane Robichaud, who was pregnant and she couldn't tell them much. She didn't know much herself and had no way to contact corporate. She was tired from trying to get out the remaining 53 life care patients. There were originally 55, but 2 had passed, including the elderly man. She also had to coordinate another life care campus by the airport. There were 7 life care patients at Memorial that relied on ventilators, 5 needing dialysis, and 1 on an assisted breathing device. The LeBlancs told her they would need to arrange ambulances to pick up the patients where they would drop them at that launch site that they came from. She couldn't and was so startlingly resigned, the LeBlancs offered to arrange it from their working cell phone. The floor leader accepted. The LeBlancs contacted an ambulance company and gave the phone to Diane, who described where the LeBlancs told her their takeoff point with the boats was. The people told her that they couldn't send anyone without an exact address. So while Diane and some colleagues went through phone books trying to find at least a cross-street name, the call dropped before they could locate one. And Diane was unable to connect on the phone with them again. Now, Diane managed to get into contact with a life care corporate representative in Shreveport, Louisiana. She quickly asked them if the company could divert some ambulances that they previously agreed to send to a staging area and instead send them to the boat launch location. The life care rep said that they would try to find the ventilator patients that had left earlier and have them transferred to other hospitals. While the floor supervisor worked out the details, the LeBlancs went back downstairs. Mark was shocked. He felt his mother needed antibiotics for a stubborn urinary infection and hydration delivered via an IV. Someone told him the hospital could no longer do intravenous fluids. Mark complained to a Memorial administrator, even though Vera was really a life care patient, but he was told that the hospital was in survival mode, not treating mode anymore. Mark wondered a valid question, quote, "Do you just flip a switch and you're not a hospital anymore?" End quote. To get ready to leave, the over 100 remaining life care and memorial patients were divided into 3 groups to help with evacuation. As they were brought downstairs, they were numbered 1, 2, or 3. Anyone who could walk around or sit up and were in decent health were marked as 1s. There would be about 3 dozen in total from memorial and life care. They were moved to the emergency ramp and expected to get rides on the airboats. Those needing more assistance and were sicker were 2s. There would be about 70 total, and they would be placed in the hallway leading up to that hole in the machine room wall that was a shortcut to the helipad. Anyone doctors felt was very ill or those with DNR orders were marked with 3s and to be evacuated last. They were moved to the second-floor lobby near an ATM in the corner. Most medical intervention and treatments ended once patients were moved from their rooms. The doctors had decided instead of sickest first, it would be sickest last, and they would not be telling the patients affected this decision or the family members or caretakers staying with them. It was purposefully kept from them. In one case, a bedridden patient was being taken to the stairs to be evacuated before staff realized she was marked as having a do not resuscitate order. They stopped in their tracks and started moving other patients around her. The nurses were told not to let the patient's daughter know she wasn't being evacuated at that time due to the DNR order. They told the patient's daughter her mother wasn't the only patient left on the floor. The other patient, James Lafayette, was dead. They did not tell the patient's daughter that. 97-year-old James Lafayette, who had Alzheimer's, had been taken to Memorial's ER by his son for a cough before Katrina. James then spent 2 days lying on Memorial's lobby floor after being discharged before being admitted. A few hours later, Michelle Petrie-Royale, the nurse that had to take the phone up and down the stairs Tuesday night while Susan and other staff rejected helicopters, found James without a pulse in his bed. I'm guessing she sounded the alarm for Code Blue because suddenly everyone was allegedly trying to revive the man. It was unsuccessful, and he stayed on the same floor with the woman and her daughter, unaware of what happened. Nurse Michelle was now shocked because a man with a walkie-talkie appeared and told her staff they had to leave the floor. She and her colleagues weren't about to abandon the last living patient on the floor, though, so Michelle allegedly told the patient's daughter that she could have the DNR order discontinued. The daughter had it approved after her mother was admitted for the storm since she was oxygen dependent. The only reason she actually had it done was because to her, it didn't make sense for her mother at 93 to be resuscitated. Quote, "If she goes into cardiac arrest, let her go." End quote. But this was totally different. She didn't want her mother left. She didn't think DNR meant do not rescue. She wanted the order canceled and appealed to the nurse's self-interest who stayed with her, even though they were ordered to leave. She mentioned, they were being kept there by them, even though they were supposed to leave. The DNR order ended up being removed, and the patient was taken down to the parking garage, leading to the helipad. Later in the day, that same Wednesday, Michael's neighbor across the street in Uptown was out of food because his kitchen was downstairs and obviously underwater. The neighbor took a chance and swam across the high flood waters to Michael and almost didn't make it. Right at the end, Michael had to get in the water and pull the guy out because he almost drowned. Michael gave him a drink to help rehydrate him. They stayed in Michael's place, listening to the radio to try and figure out next steps, and they heard that people were being rescued and brought to the Superdome or the convention center or dropped somewhere on the expressway. They could hear the people on the radio talking about how there was no police or military presence, just thousands of people everywhere without food or water. People stranded and desperately needing help. Radio reporting at the time relayed information like 9th Ward and St. Bernard Parish were underwater. People could be heard calling in to report that they were trapped and where they were trapped at. Now, Michael's experience on the 30th wasn't as terrifying as many others since his living arrangements kept him mostly safe. Remember, he was the guy who heard about Katrina and decided to prepare his apartment a little bit ahead of time and do what he could. But by comparison, residents in the now underwater St. Bernard Parish remembered barely grabbing their essential items like life jackets as they ran out of their homes. A woman who lived in the 9th Ward remembered the people living near her struggling with water rising. A couple near her weren't able to get their hands on a boat to get out. She remembered another man nearby that tied himself to what I think she said were beer kegs or something to keep float. The man floated for 3 days, and the whole time she just kept trying to encourage him, telling him that God would make a way and he would make it, but the guy would just respond telling her that he was so tired. She would let him know that she knows he's tired, and she kept encouraging him, but she could see him struggling. The woman wanted so badly to feed him, to get him food because, like I said, the water rose and it wouldn't lower for a long time. So that guy sat, floating with beer kegs with no food for several days. And the woman couldn't swim, so she couldn't get food to him. Help didn't make it in time to help her neighbor. Because the kind of help most people needed allegedly wouldn't come for a long time for everyone trapped in New Orleans. For Denise, daughter of the Essential Memorial staff member, this was heartbreaking because of how it affected people coming to the hospital for refuge. Over and over again, she would witness people risking their lives and health to make it to the hospital, only to be turned away. Now, to be fair, Denise says she completely understood where the hospital staff were coming from. To her knowledge, there were 3,000 people inside already, and they had to find a way to evacuate those people. And they were still accepting the urgent situations like snake bites and gunshot wounds, but it was still hard to witness. The instance that stuck out the most to Denise was when she was on the smoking patio on the 2nd floor, and one man came to the hospital with his wife, 2 children, and their baby. His daughter was so dehydrated, and people were yelling at him that he can't come inside the hospital. Those on the smoking patio were yelling at him to leave the baby. And he was like, I can't leave my baby, they don't have a house anymore. How was he supposed to find his baby if he left them at the hospital? He would have no way to find out where they would take him, and he had already been in the water for 2 days at this point. Whenever this happened, while there were people on the smoking balcony, they would try to toss water to the people being turned away so that they at least had safe water to drink, and they tried to toss that one family food. In fact, the day before, Tuesday, ICU nurse manager Karen Wynn had been awakened around 4 or 5 in the morning because of a code blue in the emergency room. She was confused. Why was she being summoned when ER staff could resuscitate patients themselves, and who was coming to the hospital at all when most of the city had been evacuated? All doctors were called to the ER too. When she got there, a woman who looked to be in her late 60s and her grandson were being tended to. The grandson explained his mother, lying on the gurney covered in blood, had been stabbed by her daughter in the chest with a kitchen knife after there had been a bit of drinking. The woman was conscious and talking at first, but soon began having a hard time breathing, which Karen figured meant the woman's lungs were collapsing. Emergency staff didn't really have time to verify their assumptions before a doctor cut and pushed a tube into her chest cavity to release a buildup of air, and the woman was placed on a ventilator. An exam after the fact showed that they made the right call, and luckily, open chest surgery wouldn't be needed. The woman took the last available ICU bed. Also that same day, people on Memorial's emergency ramp noticed something strange that caught their eye. They saw a mattress floating up Napoleon Avenue and turn onto Clara Street, coming closer to the hospital. On top of the mattress was an African-American woman that looked ill. The mattress was being moved by several men swimming through the toxic floodwater. Someone yelled at the group, that the hospital was closed and not accepting anybody. Memorial CEO Renee Gu, who had been at the hospital the entirety of the hurricane, decided that anyone approaching the hospital should be told to go to dry land at Napoleon Avenue and St. Charles Avenue, 9 blocks away, where Sandra LeBlanc said Memorial boat rescues would be dropped at. Not only that, a Coast Guard auxiliary member in a city about 200 miles away told the hospital staff by phone to station men at windows and doors, secure the premises, and stop entry from anyone not in uniform. Panic had escalated. A sympathetic doctor got into it with hospital administrators and convinced them to at least accept this woman on the mattress and her husband. The other men were turned away. ICU nurse manager Karen Nguyen thought it was good of the doctors to insist on accepting patients, but now someone had to care for them. Karen checked on her. The woman honestly looked dead to Karen as she laid on the stretcher near a wall. She was still breathing, but Karen says barely. According to Karen, the woman's husband confused her with his story. She said it sounded like the woman was in hospice care and had a condition that she would succumb to soon. So, while checking the woman over, Karen noticed the tube the woman had placed into her bladder to drain her urine had separated from its sterile collection bag. Karen reattached the bag, even though she knew it would eventually cause an infection because it was no longer sterile after detaching. The tube separating from the urine collection bag wet the linens that she laid on, so Karen took them so at least the woman would be dry. She also found some food for the lady and her husband to eat. The husband wanted to go home and lock up their house because he was worried about looting. Karen stopped him because it would be too dangerous. Another couple with small children rode up to Memorial and were turned away. A young, newer doctor to Memorial, Dr. Bryant King, had lost his temper at the CEO essentially for stopping them from being a hospital and helping people anymore. Dr. Bryant King, the internist who didn't want to discontinue treatments and was yelled at by Dr. Ewing Cook, was largely upset due to a vast majority of the refusals being Black people. And the fact that the hospital was holding and keeping safe cats and dogs while human beings and babies were swimming through toxic sludge. Karen Nguyen didn't think race played a part. Dr. Ewing Cook witnessed this outburst by Dr. Bryant King, and he doubled down on his impression that Bryant was not based in their current reality. Memorial wasn't a hospital to him anymore. It was a shelter running out of supplies and in need of being emptied. Ewing was worried he had his semi-auto Beretta in the pocket of his scrub pants. It was originally in his briefcase, but the CEO told him to take it out and wear it. Dr. Ewing Cook had taken over caring for his family's pets. His wife was a formal surgical intensive unit nurse, and his daughter, Stephanie, a current surgical intensive care unit nurse. Stephanie had a Newfoundland dog and 3 cats that they brought with them to the hospital. The dog had played in the floodwater before later panting heavily in the heat. Ewing's daughter tried to give their dog oxygen from the wall supply in an empty surgical building connected to the hospital's main building by a pedestrian bridge. The dog managed to make it there on unsteady legs, but as he got into the building, he collapsed and convulsed. Ewing wrote a prescription for Rolf Maybum. The dog's name was Rolf, prescribing 5 100-milligram tablets of phenobarbital, an anti-seizure medicine, from the hospital's pharmacy. On the same prescription form, Ewing ordered 8 syringes of pentothal, a half-gram each. That's a strong anesthetic. Now, only licensed veterinarians could usually prescribe medicine for animals in Louisiana, but the pharmacist turned a blind eye, I guess. Though he did insist on the written prescription as documentation before giving Ewing that very controlled substance. Ewing injected his daughter's dog, Rolf, with pentothal. It would take multiple doses before he died. Dr. Ewing Cook also euthanized one of his daughter's 3 cats that had a tooth abscess. He then went on to euthanize 2 golden retrievers that had been entrusted to him after their owners evacuated via boat. People were not allowed to take their pets with them, although those who could stuff small, quiet ones into small bags did. The owners of those golden retrievers treated them like kings and told Ewing not to abandon them to suffer alone. I suppose in a messed up way, he didn't. The longest-serving doctor at Memorial would see Ewing's daughter and wife crying after Rolf died and would describe Ewing's retelling of what happened as it being his usual aggressive way paired with a devilish laugh. That afternoon, Dr. Ewing Cook went to the ICU on the 8th floor of Memorial Medical Center, where only one patient, Johnny Burgess, the former segregation-era nurse battling uterine cancer, remained. She was the last of the 4 DNRs that were not evacuated Tuesday. According to Ewing, her medical chart notes said after the storm Monday, she cried and was agitated. On Tuesday, she was stable and responsive, and just after 1 a.m. that morning, when her electric monitors failed after losing power to her section of the hospital, and the battery-powered backup failed after that, her eyes stayed closed after the sun rose. Nurses ran fluid by gravity through her IV, but her breathing was slow and irregular. Ewing concluded 3 things. The first, that it was hard for him to go up the stairs in the heat. He had just had a second heart attack of 2 a few months prior and nearly passed out trying to move his daughter's 40-pound dog cage up the stairs when everyone was moving pets out of the flood zone days prior. He figured he wouldn't be able to go back up to the 8th floor ICU again. Now, according to Ewing, the second conclusion was that it would be impossible to drag her down 6 flights of stairs, considering how exhausted everyone was. I'm not sure how much Johnny weighed, but she was not the heaviest patient at Memorial. And lastly, in his opinion, Janie probably only had a day or so to live at best. Plus, the 4 nurses upstairs caring for her could be better utilized somewhere else, even though that wasn't his call or his job to tell them where to go. Johnny was already being given small doses of morphine for pain, as needed every few hours. But as a pulmonologist familiar with being the person who disconnected patient ventilators when patients' families decided to end their life, he prided himself on his comfort and knowledge of knowing how much morphine was needed to make sure patients weren't gasping for air as mechanical assistance was removed. Now, Johnny wasn't in pain. In fact, Ewing would admit she looked quite comfortable, but he couldn't imagine how she might react if she were to wake up and find herself being moved in the condition he felt she was in. Ewing viewed morphine being given to patients as them killing them, no matter the intention. To him, there was no small amount of danger, even if the drug is administered, quote, properly. It would also be mentioned that drugs being administered and their effect on patients all comes down to the intent of the person administering them. Dr. Ewing Cook told a nurse to increase Johnny Burgess's morphine dose and give her enough until she goes. Before writing that she had no respirations or cardiac activity on her chart, he followed that up with writing pronounced dead at and left a spot blank for a time to be filled in later. He then signed his name and walked back downstairs in what he would later double down as being, quote, a no-brainer. I gave her the medicine so I could get rid of her faster. Get the nurses off the floor. There's no question I hastened her demise, end quote. Dr. Ewing Cook would go on to have several other conversations after this that, paired with his mindset, didn't bode well for dozens of remaining patients. As far as he was concerned, they had 2 choices: speed up their deaths or abandon them. The humane thing to do to him would be to put them down. Susan Mulderick, Memorial Incident Commander, had commented to him that they had to do something about this because they were never going to get these people out. Ewing recognized progress was moving entirely too slow for the many people who needed to leave, and they might not make it. As Ewing went around the hospital, he stumbled upon patient Rodney Scott. Rodney was larger. Ewing described him as immense and motionless on a stretcher covered in sweat and hardly anything else. He thought Rodney was dead. Well, until Rodney turned over at feeling Ewing touch him to check his vitals. Rodney was a 63-year-old licensed practical nurse that used to work at Memorial. He was currently recovering from a heart attack and had several surgeries, and he weighed well over 300 pounds. Now, Rodney had long ago been determined to be the last patient to leave Memorial. A doctor was worried he might get stuck in the narrow passage being used to get the patients to the parking garage, and that would back up the evacuation line. He'd been sent to the 4th floor to wait early on, and he voiced his worry that he might not make it out of the hospital due to his size, to a nurse who didn't realize until that point that patients feared being abandoned. Rodney told Ewing to go take care of someone else because right now he was all right. Previously, when Ewing had thought about euthanizing patients, he was speaking to a Dr. John Kokemore about it, though the guy would later deny that part of the conversation ever happening. But as Ewing left the area Rodney Scott was in, he thought they wouldn't be able to get away with euthanasia because there were too many witnesses. Where Rodney and many patients ended up in areas bunched together, they were on cots or stretchers in an open area. They weren't separated into rooms anymore. About 80% of the city of New Orleans was underwater, and I don't mean 2 or 3 feet. I mean the city was literally underwater. Stores inland, not close to any waterway really, could be seen either fully underwater or at least halfway if they were a taller structure. On the low end, the water was 8 feet high, and well over 20 feet or 6 meters high in others. Right, so not heavy rains cause like flooding underwater. No, like the only thing seen above water is the tops of trees and roofs of some homes and the top halves of taller structures like grocery stores that are further inland or hospitals. Many of those who survived the actual hurricane tried to get to the 20% of the city that was dry land, which was mostly just small sections of the overpass and around the Superdome, Convention Center, and hotel. A lot of these things that I'm describing, the underwater structures, the flooding, the damage, the trash, everything, will be posted on the podcast's social media, linked in the show notes. So if you want to check it out, you totally can. Now, as people made their way to those locations, they could be seen using whatever they could to float: coolers, tires, anything. Able-bodied adults carried children, women, and elderly people on their backs through rainbow-sheened water on their way to what they hoped was safety. I've mentioned the toxic water before, and that's because it was dangerous. Floodwater, besides the danger of drowning and physical debris, has chemicals like drain cleaners, bleach, antifreeze, industrial waste, paints, and solutions containing heavy metals. There's sewage from when floodwater overwhelms the sewer systems and carries human and animal waste from the sewer pipes into the streets. I mean, floodwater, period, from anywhere literally picks up and carries anything it comes into contact with, seen and unseen. I cannot stress the importance, how dangerous even walking through floodwater is. But survivors would see areas where people's remains were floating, followed by stretches of not seeing a single person or thing. You could see people trying to tread water, pets struggling to swim and trying to find somewhere to rest. Places where the roofs of buildings were barely above water were filled with survivors waving their arms for help from news helicopters flying above, capturing footage of some of the worst moments of people's lives. Survivors stranded on roofs held up their children and begged to be rescued. They waved the shirts off their backs, yelling for help, made messages on the roofs, anything to get help from being stuck on a roof, surrounded by toxic water and without anything to eat or drink for days. Many of the helicopters did not stop to help that weren't Coast Guard or privately hired. They gathered the information they needed and left. But after Katrina hit, and it was safe to do so, allegedly local firefighters, paramedics, and anyone else with access to boats went around trying to help who they could. Those who were rescued were dropped off at that bridge on Interstate 10 Cloverleaf, the overpass that looks like Woodstock after the concert. And people would try to walk to the Superdome or Convention Center from there. Now, it wasn't pre-planned for people to go to the Convention Center, but it happened by word of mouth and also because the mayor opened it up as a second location once the Superdome was overwhelmed. The area was high and dry, and it was so easy for people to see and head for. Denise and her family were at Memorial Hospital themselves about 2 days before they left. Denise said that people inside had run out of water after the first night, with everyone sharing what they bought, just thinking that they would be able to go home in a bit. They didn't really ration or bring enough to sustain them for more than a couple days. So when Denise and her family were told that they were going to be dropped off by boat somewhere, I'm sure they jumped at the chance. They were told they would be dropped at a corner and the bus would pick them up and that they'd be taken to Texas. But according to Denise, what actually happened was that they got to that corner and realized there were no buses. Denise said the police were asking people in the crowd if they knew how to drive trucks and buses because they had to commandeer vehicles. Allegedly, they were stealing them. She said, quote, "The police had to steal vehicles, and so it was totally different than what we anticipated," end quote. To be clear, at this point, it sounds like they were just taking school buses and large vehicles capable of moving large amounts of people, not just the random car. But Denise and her family didn't get a ride to the convention center on a commandeered bus. The police had to wave down a locksmith van driving around and asked him to drive them to their destination. So they make it to the convention center, and all they see are people all over the street and under the bridge. And understandably, they're wondering, why are so many people on the street and not inside of the convention center? People warned them that they didn't want to go in there. So Denise, who was in the Army, stopped eating and drinking once they got there. She thought if you don't put anything in, nothing should come out. And while they were there, every 4 hours, the National Guard, because yes, some members were also there. I'll get into what resources were where and why in another part, because that is, well, you'll see. But every 4 hours, Denise said they were running drills with everyone. Like they kept telling them to line up for buses that never came every 4 hours. Denise said the National Guard members said things like, quote, "You all have to line up for the bus. And if you bum rush the bus, they're just going to take off without you. And nobody is going to get you to go anywhere. You have to line up. You have to be in a straight line," end quote. And she went on to say that they have old people in wheelchairs and women with babies in lines and waiting for buses they know aren't coming. It was like they were playing with them. That night, they slept on the sidewalk outside, surrounded by trash because trash was all over the ground. There wasn't a clean spot anywhere, to the point where Denise couldn't figure out how her family members would even be able to lay down with their babies. And things would only get worse from there. But at Memorial Medical Center, things took a decidedly horrifying turn for the worse. There was still 115 Memorial patients in the hospital and over 40 in wheelchair, 30 bedridden, and up to 60 were fragile, and according to an email amongst the parent company leaders, those 60 were at least partially expected to die in the next 24 hours, 30 to 45 probably passing overnight. Angela McManus was the advocate for her 70-year-old mother, Wilda, a patient at Memorial. Wilda was once the patient information manager at Charity Hospital for quite a while, actually. Angela quit her job to be with her mother and act as her full-time caregiver. Ensuring her mother's dignity was her top priority, to the point where Wilda's hospital paperwork had a note that said, quote, "Daughter stays with patient at all times." Angela lived in a reclining chair or cot for days at a time, witnessing mistakes being made, making life and death decisions, and dealing with stressful test results while she cared for her mother. At times, Wilda could be difficult to understand due to a stroke that she suffered years before and the way certain medicines turned her brain to mush. But her mother's death wasn't currently at their doorstep. At least, not yet. Angela wasn't delusional. She knew it might be soon time to say goodbye to her mother, but not yet. She wasn't there yet. The day Katrina made landfall, Angela turned down surgery for her mother on backup power for an infection Wilda had that worsened. Angela didn't think there was sense in reviving her mother with CPR, electric shocks, or any of the typical extraordinary measures that came with resuscitation. It wouldn't stop her chronic underlying health problems. But that didn't mean give up on Wilda. However, All Wednesday, Wilda and Angela watched dozens of life care patients be wrapped in sheets to be carried through the stairs to the helipad. On several occasions, nurses came back crying after losing a patient during the move. There wasn't a door between the hospital and the parking garage under the helipad. Without the elevators, they would have had to go outside to access the garage, not an option with the flooding from Katrina. Or carried patients down to the first floor, gone through 2 doorways into a separate stairwell, and go up to the second floor landing that opened into a garage. So instead, like I've mentioned, there's a hole that people were being passed to get to the helipad. And that hole leading from that machine room to the helipad created a direct route. Someone remembered a hidden passage inside that machine room, a rectangular-shaped 3x3-ish foot opening lined by rough concrete. It was usually covered by a piece of hinged metal and likely created to allow equipment to be serviced directly from the garage, but it's where patients were being passed through with staff on either side of that hole to help lift patients through it. Now, nearly as often as the nurses would return, in tears, Wilda would tell her daughter to shut a nurse's dog up that barked nonstop in a room near them. During Angela's time there, her allergies to pets would flare up when the animals would escape their cages, dogs and cats alike. She heard nurses talk about being worried of having to leave their pets behind to be euthanized. According to her, the nurses spent more time worrying about and babying their pets than caring for her mother. She could hear nurse assistants going back and forth about whose turn it was to toilet and clean patients in the unbearable heat. Angela nursed her mother, replaced her colostomy bag, fed her through her feeding tube, and had to spend hours trying to get a nurse to help her wipe down her mother's oozing back wounds with alcohol since there was no running water. She needed help drying and changing Wilda after that, too. Angela spent all day Wednesday trying to get a doctor to rescind her mother's DNR order. She also wasn't really a fan of the idea that her mother was now last because of that order. She felt better hearing staff complain that they couldn't leave Memorial until every patient was gone, though. She figured her mother wouldn't be left behind. Now, Angela was being pressured to leave, as many non-patients were, so she asked where her mother would be taken. Life care nurse executive Teresa Mendez told her she didn't have a clue, but to put Angela's number on her mom, and they could be reunited that way. Now, Wilda's skin was too wet for the permanent marker to show, but they wrote contact info and a message on gauze and wrapped that around Wilda's right arm and leg, where it would be shown below her hospital gown. Then Angela was sent downstairs to wait in line for a boat. Upstairs, Wilda was on the 7th floor with a woman the infectious disease doctor that gave Wilda that DNR order thought looked gravely ill. That ill-looking patient was Elaine Nelson, and the doctor didn't think she would survive the night. She had trouble breathing and her eyes were glazed. Her daughter, Catherine, was downstairs waiting on transport near Angela. 76-year-old Merle Lagasse was in a private patient room on the 4th floor early Wednesday afternoon before 4 men lifted her using the 4 corners of her hospital bedsheet. Merle had recently been treated for emphysema by Dr. Ewing Cook prior to him retiring, and he would always greet Merle saying, quote, "Merle, you're gonna make a beautiful corpse," end quote. Merle only registered being called beautiful. Her daughter Karen, who I'll call Kay since there's already a nurse Karen in this story, was not a fan of him saying that to her mother. Merle recently discovered that she had lung cancer and had been admitted to Memorial about a week before the storm because of a bad reaction she had to a pain medicine patch. Dr. Roy Collada had admitted her to the hospital to help relieve her shortness of breath, the chronic anxiety that sticks to someone who can't get enough air in their bodies, as much as they want, and the pain that she was undergoing. Along with the breathing treatment, Roy planned to tap the fluid in the left side of Merle's chest cavity that constricted her lungs. It's called thoracentesis, and it's when medical professionals use a sterile needle and a flexible tube to hit the fluid in a patient's thorax. It provides relief anywhere from days to weeks until fluid builds up again. The day before the hurricane, Saturday or Sunday, Roy ordered the thoracentesis kit and it was placed at Merle's bedside. It was still there on Wednesday. On Monday afternoon, after the wind from Katrina died down, Kay saw Roy in the parking garage, but he told her he was going home to shower. Kay hadn't seen the guy since then, and that kit stayed beside her mother's bed until this point. Kay had taken over a large portion of her mother's care after the storm. She covered Merle in ice packs, made sure a box fan was aimed at her. As needed, she prayed in the chapel for her mother and their cats that she was terrified drowned at their home where they left them with food and water. To Kay, when the power failed overnight into Tuesday at Memorial, it took entirely too long for nurses on the 4th floor to figure out what was the cause of the high-flow oxygen machine ringing. The respiratory therapists stopped checking in with them, and when they took away the machine that aided her mother's breathing and replaced it with the less effective mask connected through the wall into Memorial's bulk oxygen supply, Kay was incredibly anxious. When the power failed, she went from box fan to fanning Merle with cardboard, and after being previously told her mother would be one of the first to leave Memorial, since she was equipment reliant, needing it to breathe, that quickly changed when her doctor asked if Merle could sit in a wheelchair. Kay didn't think her mother could sit in a wheelchair, and soon she saw patients that could walk or sit in wheelchairs leave before them. Once it was finally time for Kay's mother to join the evacuation line, Merle's oxygen tube was removed from the wall supply and attached to a green cylinder of gas instead. Kay asked the nurse if they should bring the thoracentesis kit along, still wrapped in plastic on the bedside table. The nurse told Kay they wouldn't be doing that now. Merle was then carried downstairs headfirst on her bedsheet by volunteers before they realized that it would be better to turn her so that she was being carried down feet first instead. They only needed to go down 2 flights of stairs before they put her in the line of patients going towards the machine room on the 2nd floor. Laying flat made it harder for Merle to breathe. A nurse checking on her realized this at some point and shouted that Merle needed to go now before turning up the flow of air in her oxygen tank to its maximum setting. Kay was told that she would have to leave the area, and they began moving her mother towards the heliport, but Kay turned back when she heard her mom yell her name and say that she couldn't breathe. Merle's oxygen tank had been disconnected just before she was about to get passed through that hole in the wall to go to the parking garage that led to the heliport. Kay shouted at the person who looked like they were a doctor in charge that her mother couldn't breathe without the oxygen tank, and they needed to put it back on her. The maybe doctor responded to Kay that she didn't know what was going on and that Merle would get oxygen once she was through the hole. Kay needed to leave. Other staff stood around and stared at the exchange. Kay was so peeved at how insensitive the doctor was. It was all she could do to quickly leave and get on a boat so that she could get somewhere that would allow her to determine where her mother would be sent because she didn't want her mom to be alone. Kay and Merle would not meet each other at the same location the way Kay hoped for, though. Nurse Kathy Green went up to the parking garage. She just couldn't bear continuing to look at the sick patients on cots in the 2nd floor lobby. They all looked so sick without their treatments and medication. She would fan them and give them water, but eventually she needed to go elsewhere. On the asphalt of the parking garage, she saw patients lying and waiting for rescue. An elderly woman was among them. Her lungs sounded like they were filled with fluid, and her oxygen tank was empty. Nurse Kathy asked a few other people to help her sit the woman up, and she gave the woman an inhalation treatment to clear her lungs and try to reassure her. According to Kathy, a doctor came up to her, looked at the woman's chart, and saw that she had lung cancer, and told Kathy the patient wasn't going anywhere. The doctor looked at the patient's oxygen tank, shook his head no, and told her that was it. No more respiratory treatments. Her quarter tank of oxygen left would be the last. According to Nurse Kathy, she felt numb after this. This was someone's grandmother, and considering her own daughter kept calling in a panic, saying that she had a feeling something terrible happened to her grandmother. In the now underwater St. Bernard Parish, it felt personal. Kathy left the elderly woman and decided to go help another patient. She didn't want to witness the woman die on the parking garage floor in an American city. She didn't even want to know the elderly woman's name. No doctor would stay the night on the 7th floor, so the infectious disease doctor told life care nurses at Memorial to give a small injection of Ativan and morphine to any agitated or restless patients. They wouldn't have an easy way to contact a physician. During boat evacuations that day, while Memorial doctors had taken over loading patients onto boats to get out of the suffocating heat in the hospital, they allowed hospital employees, their own family members, and family of other staff to leave. Hundreds of people still remained inside Memorial, but there had been noticeably less staff as the days passed and staff left to monitor patients during transport. Or they were allowed to leave because their own patients were either transported or passed away, but did not have an obligation to assist with others. Although, to be clear, several staff did stay and help with patients after theirs were gone. Remaining life care nurses would take Xanax to help with their own anxiety while they stayed on the 7th floor injecting any agitated patients. Now, like all of these are federally controlled substances, locked away, they need to be signed out, criminal penalty for misuse type of thing. But the doctor gave that order. The pharmacist who would have had to stay in the pharmacy to continue filling repeated orders didn't feel safe. I assume because of the radio spewing all sorts of crime and the rumors going on. Instead, the pharmacist got 2 boxes of morphine, 25 vials each, and a similar box of Ativan, and passed them all over to a nurse on duty to use. Honor system. The nurse he gave them to had a narcotics addiction and lost her license in the past for prescription abuse. She just got probation from the nursing board 2 weeks before Katrina for treating patients with drugs not ordered by a doctor. She was required to be closely supervised in a restricted environment. The nurse would cave to the temptation of drugs that night. She had chronic back pain. She took morphine. Wilda McManus looked like she could use something to the nurse too to quiet her down. Just before midnight, the nurse gave Wilda a small dose of Ativan. Angela wasn't there to warn her that the drug had an opposite effect on Wilda. It would lead to something far worse. And Wilda McManus wouldn't be the only patient at Memorial to suffer that fate, the only New Orleanian to suffer due to systemic failure, and the only lesson to be buried under the guise of a hurricane being to blame. To find out the rest of the truth about what really happened during Hurricane Katrina, in a system of failures from the federal government down to civilians on the ground, that has yet to be corrected or answered for to this day. Come back on Thursday for part 2. Stay safe and see you next week. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.